Whether you're looking to build a website for your business, your hobby, your podcast, or just for fun, Pair Networks is your go-to web hosting partner. Not only do we have the lowest domain price in the industry, starting at just $11, we've got hundreds of stunning website templates to help you stand out from the crowd. You're not a techie? Not a problem. With our easy DIY site builders, you can launch your impressive website without any technical know-how. And when it comes to security and updates, don't worry, we've got you covered. Our 24/7 US-based customer support is the best in the industry. Check out pair.com today to learn more. PAIR.com.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and on this episode, I have a new Agatha Christie short story for you. We will be covering The Actress by Agatha Christie, also known as A Trap for the Unwary. But first, I won't spend a long time on this, but I mentioned in my last episode that tickets are now on sale for the Agatha Christie Festival in Torquay in September. My event was close to selling out, and then there were an infusion of seats, so there are still some seats available. These too seem to be going quickly, but I just want to encourage anyone who hasn't yet visited the site to do so. You can click on the link I've provided in the notes. I would love to see you there. We will be crowning Agatha Christie's greatest screen adaptation. It's going to be so much fun. I am going on tour very shortly for 2 weeks in April for my debut mystery novel, The Busybody. Perhaps you've heard me talk about it. Perhaps you've read it at this point. Or perhaps you'd like to get a signed copy of the book and would like to hear me talk about it a little bit more in depth. In that case, you are in luck. I'll be in New York, both Manhattan and Long Island, on April 9th and April 11th. I'll be in Connecticut in 2 different locations, in Avon and Madison, both on Friday, April 12th. And at the second of those events in Madison, I will be in conversation with Lauren E. Rico, author of Familia. I'll be in Massachusetts on Monday, April 15th, in Maine on Tuesday, April 16th. And then on April 18th, I'm headed to Michigan, Grand Rapids, where I will be recording a live episode of this very podcast. The next day, I'll be in Perrysburg, Ohio. And the day after that, I am back in Michigan in Ann Arbor, where I will be speaking in conversation with Colleen Cambridge, who is the author of the Phillida Bright mysteries. So there's lots going on there with this 2-week tour that I'm about to embark on. I really, really hope to see as many of you as possible. I know that it's a big commitment to come out on a weekday in the early evening. But if you're on the fence, let me just get you off that fence and in the bookstore, because that is where I want you to be. That is where I am going to be. And I'll see you there. Click on the link to my website in the show notes for more on all of those tour dates. Okay, before I get into some mailbag/general housekeeping for the podcast, I just want to list the titles that I will be spoiling in the course of this episode. I did this in my last episode where I was speaking with Teresa Peschel because we spoiled so many different stories that it was just too difficult to tell people to fast forward a couple of minutes or what have you when a Christie title came up. And I actually really liked listing the titles at the beginning so that I didn't have to worry about telling you to fast forward. And I am going to try to do that from now on. I think this format works a lot better. I'm also going to list these titles in the show notes. We'll see if I can continue to be this organized about spoilers. I'm not sure this is sustainable, but it's becoming the new standard operating procedure for now. So here are the short stories and novels that are spoiled in the course of this episode. And again, this is in general order of spoilage. The Murder on the Links, Cat Among the Pigeons, Miss Marple Tells a Story, The Affair at the Bungalow, Murder in the Mews, 3-Act Tragedy, Death in the Clouds, And Then There Were None, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, Lord Edgware Dies, and Evil Under the Sun. If you are worried about having any of those titles spoiled, you may want to read them before you proceed with this episode. I'm always in favor of reading more Christie. So go ahead and pause it and read up and then come back to this moment here. All right, moving on to our mailbag and general housekeeping for the podcast overall. I like to start with the most recent episode and work my way backward. So I am actually going to start with a future episode because I am putting out a general call I want you to let me know what your favorite YA mystery titles are, or YA mystery authors. In a future episode, I will be doing a roundup / overall reaction to what's available out there. One of you recently made me aware of this fantastic children's picture book called 10 Loopy Caterpillars, which is an extremely witty and dark spin on And Then There Were None for children. As many of you know, I have a 7-year-old. My oldest is 7. So I am really beginning to be on the lookout in earnest for YA mystery fare. We're not quite there yet, but we're almost there. I've interviewed Maureen Johnson in the past on this podcast, and I've talked a little bit here and there about some YA mystery titles that I like, but I've never really considered YA mystery overall. And I'd really like to do that because I think a lot of us are big fans of the genre. And it's how we came to be Agatha Christie fans, or at least it went hand in hand with our early love of Agatha Christie. So shoot me an email at allaboutthedame@gmail.com, or get in touch with me on social media at allaboutthedame on Twitter, or at allaboutagatha on Instagram. I read all the comments and messages that I get, so I'd love to hear from people about their favorite YA mystery titles and authors. Okay, let's move on to a comment about my episode on The Island with guest co-host Sarah Hinlicky Wilson. Here's what one of you had to say. I loved the episode on The Island, and your guest host really knew her stuff. I also loved the weaving of your knowledge of Agatha Christie with Sarah's theological knowledge. As you were talking about Agatha Christie's piety, are you aware of the Agatha Christie indult? I'll attach a link, but here's the TLDR. When the Roman Catholic Church discontinued the Latin Mass around 1970, a number of British people, including non-Roman Catholics, wrote to the Pope asking that the Latin Mass be allowed in England and Wales. Agatha Christie was one of the signatories, and reputedly, the Pope recognized her name in particular, and so granted permission. That permission was granted in 1971 by Pope Paul VI. Indult, by the way, is a term that I had never heard before. It's referring to the giving of permission to do something that would be forbidden without that permission. So I love that Agatha Christie was responsible for this indult, which is yet more proof of her high Anglican leanings, I think. And I also would just like to point out that in the article of Sarah's that I mentioned on the episode, Agatha Christie, a very elusive Christian, this is the article that Sarah published recently. She mentions this fact about the Agatha Christie indult. She did not mention it on the episode, but she is very aware of the Agatha Christie indult. But it's such a fun fact, I just figured I would mention it here. Okay, moving on now to the issue of the best last Christie, which is a philosophical question I pondered at the beginning of my gargantuan, bumper-sized Mousetrap episode. A few of you responded to me about this, as I knew you would. And here's what you had to say. First up, in response to the question from another listener about which book should be their final first-time Christie, I thought I would share my thoughts. My suggestion is very different to yours. I suggest that, of the options given, The Murder on the Links should be chosen. I clearly have a lot more fondness for this novel and its puzzle than the podcast does, smiley face. And as a Hastings narrated story, it has an emotional pull that makes it appealing for a last new novel. What really clinches it for me, though, is the bittersweet end. With Hastings falling in love and marrying, the reader is happy for him, but also knows that Poirot's relationship with his sidekick can never be the same again. It is a natural ending, and reading it last would feel like a way of honoring how Christie herself wanted to say goodbye. After all, she spent much of her career intending that her final novel, or at least Poirot's final outing, would involve focusing on his relationship with Hastings and its inevitable end, albeit she planned a more definitive end. So I hope I've made a good enough case for The Murder on the Links to throw its hat into the ring. Indeed you did, and you're right, The Murder on the Links does not get a ton of love on this podcast. It's not one of my favorites. So I wanted to shine a little readerly light and appreciation on it. Thank you for that, listener. Here is the next listener email about the best last Christie. I am chiming in about the question you asked in a recent episode of the podcast. A listener asked what was the best Agatha Christie to conclude with, and I think you gave her excellent advice in terms of the 6 she was left with. I will say, in my experience, I didn't intend to end in any particular way, but my final Christie wound up being exactly right, for me at least. My final Christie was a pocket full of rye. Over the series, I learned that I am very much a Miss Marple girly. So when I only had 8 or so books left, I made a game plan and made sure that of the 3 or so Marples I had left, I would definitely end with one of those. By random chance, that ended up meaning I ended with Rye. It was the perfect way to cap off my big mission to read all 66 mysteries because the final lines of that book are just exquisite. You said as much in the podcast episode where you reviewed it. And then this listener reproduced those final lines, so I will happily read them out now. The tear rose in Miss Marple's eyes. Succeeding pity, there came anger. Anger against a heartless killer. And then, displacing both these emotions, there came a surge of triumph. The triumph some specialist might feel who has successfully reconstructed an extinct animal from a fragment of jawbone and a couple of teeth. This listener went on to write, "This ending gave me chills. I love this final vision of my favorite sleuth as a clear-eyed excavator of evil deeds. Jurassic Park meets Miss Marple perfection." Thank you, listener. That is an excellent defense of A Pocket Full of Rye as the best last Christie. I love it. Those closing lines of A Pocket Full of Rye were also highlighted by Teresa Peschel on my last episode. They really are some of the best that Christie wrote. And I would just add that they provide a stunning contrast to the closing scene of Nemesis, which is, in a true sense, the final Miss Marple novel. I won't read out those lines now, but I think even though they're quite different in tone, we have Miss Marple sort of fading into the ether. The timeless, immortal, happy, bacon slicer brained Miss Marple. It's definitely a much lighter depiction of where she ends up, but Christie does something similar, I think, in Nemesis, with the intention of that being the final time that we see Miss Marple. And I never thought to compare that closing scene of Nemesis to the closing lines of A Pocket Full of Rye, because even though there's a contrast in tone, she is doing something similar in both books. And this is an excellent moment to remind all of you that one of the many reasons I love the Miss Marple novels as much as I do is that they're just really well written. They tend to be, I think, on average, a little better written or more interestingly written or more thoughtfully written than the Poirots. I know those are fighting words for a lot of you out there, and there are obviously many stupendously written Poirots, such as, Five Little Pigs, our #1 ranked Christie novel, but there really is just something special about these Miss Marple novels and her depiction of Miss Marple. You can feel Christie's passion in those lines. Anyway, thank you for that, listener. And we come now to our final comment on the best last Christie. Here goes. What an interesting dilemma for that reader, and what an eclectic list of titles to choose from. There is a quandary that comes from knowing all 6 books so well. You and I can easily dismiss Passenger to Frankfurt, The Clocks, and Third Girl as lesser works, all with features of interest, but get them out of the way and let your final read be as positive as possible. That leaves Taken at the Flood and Cat Among the Pigeons. I'm sure your choice was the right one, as it comes almost literally at the end of Christie's own golden age. It was actually the last Christie title I read myself. I actually came upon a used copy in an old bookstore and had no idea that the book existed, so it felt like an undiscovered treasure. But it's definitely a book that works better for a mature reader. I loved the Claude family, but I ended up being disappointed by that complex yet fractured solution. Meanwhile, I have adored Cat Among the Pigeons from the first read. The school setting, the trick with 2 murderers, the hunky gardener spy, I was definitely pubescent by then, the tragic end of Miss Chadwick, I could go on, and I would probably choose Cat Among the Pigeons as my recommendation for all those reasons. I, too, love Cat Among the Pigeons. I remember being surprised by how much I loved it because the book is so overstuffed and there are thriller hijinks and Poirot really makes a late appearance and it's by no means perfect, but I enjoyed the heck out of that book when Catherine and I reread it for the podcast. So I think Cat Among the Pigeons is a defensible answer for the best last Christie. All right, moving on now to my Mousetrap episode. I heard from a former guest co-host on the podcast. This would be Tina Hodgkinson, who is one of my guest co-hosts on the All About Ableism episode that Tina and I and 2 other guest co-hosts did. Tina also does guided tours in London and is a scholar of Agatha Christie, an agathologist who regularly appears at the Agatha Christie Festival and the Agatha Christie Conference. She too recently published an article about Agatha Christie and ableism, which she worked on in the wake of the All About Ableism episode. So Tina is just an endless source of knowledge when it comes to Agatha Christie, and I was not surprised, though thrilled, when she contacted me halfway through the Mousetrap episode. I don't blame her for having to listen to it in pieces. It was over 4 hours long after all. Here's what she wrote. I am only partly through your episode on the Mousetrap. I had to stop it when you started comparing the 70th anniversary edition and the Samuel French editions. The latter I don't have, as I have viewed the prompt book and I was wondering how that compared to the 70th edition. I've made some notes which I've attached. I think some of the differences are due to the Samuel French edition sticking to the original script and not the changes in the prompt book. I hope you find this of suitably nerdy interest. This prompt book was used for the first 12 years of the play's history. And I pored over the attachment that Tina so kindly provided because it shows how there were these additions that were made in the prompt book, which is the book that's used while the play is being produced night after night after night. There were all these changes written into it that seem to have been incorporated into the 70th anniversary edition of the script, but which were not incorporated into the Samuel French edition, which just stuck to the original script. So that may be the reason for the changes that I noted in the episode between the 70th anniversary edition and the Samuel French edition. And it was my friend and also former co-host Christopher Deal who first brought those changes to my attention. For example, in the prompt book, there was a line added about Mrs. Barlow, the housekeeper at Monkswell Manor, leaving the wireless on again. That seems to be a line that got added at some point during the first 12 years of the play's production, probably because audience members were like, why is the radio on at the beginning of this play? Chris and I had ascribed that to Agatha Christie, with the Samuel French edition for some reason leaving that line out, but perhaps Christie did not write that line, and it was over the course of the first 12 years of the play being produced that the producers realized the line needed to be in there. And then when the 70th anniversary edition got printed, that extra line was included, whereas it doesn't appear in the Samuel French edition. I doubt that this explains all of the differences between these two versions, but I will bet you that it explains many of them. So that is really fascinating, and I want to thank Tina for getting in touch with me about that. I knew it would be of interest to many of you. Also of interest, I hope, is a listener writing into me about Bertha Waddell. This is a fairly arcane reference that I discussed during the Mousetrap episode. Christopher Wren is said to pantomime in the style of Bertha Waddell, who was this performer who put on lots of plays and theatrical fare for children in the 20th century. And I was theorizing that Christie was probably familiar with Bertha Waddell through her daughter and or her grandson seeing one of these performances. But I couldn't find out all that much about Bertha Waddell, and one of you wrote in to help me out. So here is what you had to say. Hi, regarding Bertha Waddell's style, I found this. Don't know if you've already seen it. And this listener went on to quote from the University of Glasgow's School of Culture and Creative Arts. They had a blog post in 2020 titled Bertha Waddell's Children's Theatre, Combing the Scottish Theatre Archive for Remnants of a Theatre Company Especially for Children. And here's the relevant quote. Bertha's original scripts were reportedly destroyed at her request in the 1980s, and the wealth of props and costumes donated to a local college since disbanded. However, we do have a handful of black and white photographs of stage sets and actors, colored by descriptions from various other sources. Newspaper cuttings and living memories give us enticing details which bring the company to life. One year, there was a particularly memorable bright green dress amongst the immaculate costumes, an apron starched in stark white, and always an overall impactful, good stage picture. Detailed descriptions of how best to achieve certain props, costume, and even vocal phrasing noted by Bertha in her 4 volumes of rhymes for performance also give clues to her style and ethos, and what the audience would expect. That audience, suffice to say, was rapt, paid close attention, and in exchange were imbued with what was often their first, influential experience of theater. Noted for her clear diction and for being somewhat glamorous, very theatrical, and genteel and ladylike, small hints in minutiae like these tell us that Bertha knew her business well and took it seriously. And this listener then went on to write, so I guess it means over-theatrical with very precise enunciation. Perhaps a bit camp? That sounds right to me, listener. I think Bertha Waddell was a bit camp, as was Christopher Wren. So thank you for that bit of cultural context. And then finally, my last bit of mail here in the podcast mailbag has to do with my episode about the new Miss Marple short stories. My friend Brad Friedman co-hosted that episode with me. We talked about all 12 of the short stories in that collection. And when we were talking about the Jade Empress in particular, we said that we couldn't think in the moment of any other Miss Marple story in which the invisibility of the maid was a key factor. And even in that moment, we both knew that we simply weren't thinking of a Miss Marple story that had to exist. And two of you actually wrote in to supply us with that story. Here's what one of you had to say. I have that story. It's called, in my book anyway, Miss Marple Tells a Story, with which she writes to Raymond and Joan West about a time in which she helped a client of Mr. Petherick who was suspected of killing his wife in a hotel. It turned out to be another guest who disguised herself as a maid and went into the man's wife's room, stabbed her, then exited through the man's room. He thought nothing of it because the real maid had previously gone through his room into the wife's room. And you are absolutely right, listener. That is a Miss Marple story in which the fact that maids are not looked at too closely and generally dismissed is the key to solving the mystery. So thank you very much for that to both listeners. It is now time to talk about a new Agatha Christie short story. So let's get into some publication history. I can't wait. This story was first published in the Novel magazine in May 1923 as A Trap for the Unwary, which is the title under which it was republished in a booklet issued in 1990 to mark the centenary of Agatha Christie's birth. There was this big celebration down in Torquay during which, and this is the event the occasion is most remembered for, David Suchet as Monsieur Poirot and Joan Hickson as Miss Marple met at the train station there in Torquay. Many photos were snapped. You can totally dig up a video of this moment on the internet without trying too hard, if you would like. So it was a big event, and this booklet was printed for it, including this story, which is one that up till then almost no one had read, since it had been serialized so early, but never collected in book form. And I just have to shout out an extremely loyal and dedicated listener and patron who found this short story in that centennial booklet from 1990, and she had no idea what it was, and she wrote in to me to ask about it. I, too, was at a loss. I had never heard of A Trap for the Unwary. So this listener then took a screenshot of the story within this centenary booklet for me to look at. But the screenshot was, sort of tiny and blurry, as screenshots can be. So I couldn't really read it. And do you know what this listener did unprompted? She transcribed the entire story for me. And I want to be clear that this was unprompted because I would never ask any of you to do such a thing for me. But I so appreciate that she did. This episode is officially in your honor, loyal listener. You know who you are. So this short story, A Trap for the Unwary, was originally titled by Agatha Christie, The Actress. And we know that because it was published under its original title in the 1997 book collection, While the Light Lasts and Other Stories. This collection was edited and annotated by friend of the podcast, Tony Medawar, who is actually the one to have discovered this quote-unquote long-lost short story. While the Light Lasts is a wonderful collection that features all sorts of odds and ends within the Christie oeuvre of short stories, there's stories that had fallen through the cracks and not been published in book form before. I'm thrilled to report that of the 9 stories published in this collection, we have covered on the regular podcast and Patreon only 4 of them thus far, 5 if you count this episode. So that means we still have 4 more of these outlier short stories to go. None of them feature any of Christie's series-long detectives, of course, but even so, I think that's a cause for celebration. I love knowing that there's a little more Christie out there for us to discuss. So let's talk about the victim of this story. Well, this is one of those stories where there is a seeming victim and then an actual victim. Or you could make the argument that any of the 3 major players in the scheme that unfolds in this story is the main victim, actually. But if I spelled it out now, I'd basically have told you the whole story. So let's make like the infamous Facebook relationship status and simply say, it's complicated. All right, let's talk suspects. First up, we have Jake Levitt, who is described in the very first sentence of this story as a shabby man. He seems desperate for cash, and you know what they say about desperate times. Next up, we have Olga Stormer, a celebrated actor, and seemingly the titular actress of this story, whose name is actually Nancy Taylor. More on her in a moment. Next up, we have Miss Jones, who is Olga's secretary. She barely appears in the story, but we must suspect everyone in a Christie, mustn't we? Especially the help. Next, we have Sid Danahan, Olga Stormer's somewhat put-upon manager. He kind of has a lot to deal with in this story, but is he ultimately behind all of it? We've seen such high-end professional types, such as doctors, turn out to be guilty in many a Christie, so let's not discount him. Next, we have Margaret Ryan, who is Olga Stormer's understudy. An actor who doubles for another actor?
Intruder alert! Intruder alert! Intruder alert! Intruder alert!
Color me intrigued. Next, we have Sir Richard Everard, MP. He is Olga Stormer's new politician fiancé, whose career would fall to pieces if any sort of a scandal ever attached to him. And finally, we have an unnamed maid in the flat of Olga Stormer, because once again, let us never underestimate the help. This maid makes a late appearance, but we would do well not to forget her. All right, let's talk about the world as it appears to be. We open on a man, Jake Levitt, watching a play. This play is called The Avenging Angel, and it includes an actress named Olga Stormer, who is playing the role of Cora, and she is making quite the sensation doing so. In fact, Olga Stormer has been making quite the sensation for a few years now. Her name has become a household word. But as is so often the case with actors, there is more to Olga Stormer than meets the eye, and Jake Levitt knows something about that. Jake Levitt knows that Olga Stormer is really Nancy Taylor. And apparently there's something in Nancy Taylor's past that she will be motivated enough to keep quiet that he thinks he can blackmail her. We quickly get the sense that blackmailing people is something Jake does quite regularly. He's basically a scoundrel. And for the entire story, we're waiting for the comeuppance we're pretty sure he's going to receive. And let me tell you, listeners, it does not disappoint when it comes. So Jake sends a threatening letter to Olga, indicating as such, but he does so obliquely, and the letter is worth reading out. It's really great. Dear Madam, I much appreciated your performance in The Avenging Angel last night. I fancy we have a mutual friend in Miss Nancy Taylor, late of Chicago. An article regarding her is to be published shortly. If you would care to discuss same, I would call upon you at any time convenient to yourself. Yours respectfully, Jake Levitt. That yours respectfully plays the same way to me as this fabulous line in Hamilton.
I have the honor to be your obedient servant, A. Bird.
Speaking of plays that have made quite the sensation, Hamilton, good show. I don't know if you've heard of it. Olga Stormer knows exactly what Jake is getting at, even if her manager, Sid Danahan, doesn't. Sid asks who this Nancy Taylor is, and Olga replies, a girl who would be better dead, Danny. There was bitterness in her voice and a weariness that revealed her 34 years. A girl who was dead until this carrion crow brought her to life again. All right, I'd just like to point out two things. There are quotation marks around this line of Olga's, a girl who was dead until this carrion crow brought her to life again. So I figured Christie had to be quoting a well-known play or poem, something say by Shakespeare or Tennyson, but I couldn't find anything. If anyone knows what Christie might be quoting here, let me know. She could merely be making up a convincing sounding line from the sort of play Olga Stormer would star in, which is much more impressive. So let's assume that's what she's doing here. Second, given that the story was almost definitely written around the time it was published, Christie herself would have been 33 or so when she wrote this story. So I like that she makes Olga basically the same age. 34 strikes me as a good age for someone in Olga's position. She's old enough to have a robust past, but still young enough to care deeply about her future. In other words, she's middle-aged. Anyway, Danny, which is Olga's nickname for Sid Danahan, and which I'd like to point out predates by 15 years a much more famous Danny, whose nickname also comes from her last name. That would be Mrs. Danvers from Rebecca, of course. Hair drill Danny. Anyway, this Danny finally understands that Olga Stormer is Nancy Taylor, and he tries troubleshooting the problem. First, he tells her to just deny everything. But Olga says that Jake Levitt is too experienced to approach her without solid evidence of what she did in the past. Then he suggests the police. She immediately ixnays that suggestion. And I love this line from Christie. Beneath her self-control, though he did not guess it, was the impatience of the keen brain watching a slower brain laboriously cover the ground it had already traversed in a flash. In other words, catch up, Danny. Danny then suggests that she might want to say something to her new fiancé, Sir Richard Everard, but Olga informs Danny that she told Sir Richard all about her past when he asked her to marry him. So her relationship is not in danger here if her secret gets out, but both her career and Sir Richard's career will go smash, as she puts it, and that is a big problem. According to Olga, there are only two things she can do. Pay up, which will of course never end. The unscrupulous Jake Levitt will probably continue to squeeze her until she's destitute, or she can disappear and start over again. Olga is particularly aggrieved about these options because it's not like she even regrets what she did. And here's where we find out what she did. I'm quoting here from the text. I was a half-starved little gutter waif, Danny, striving to keep straight. I shot a man, a beast of a man who deserved to be shot. The circumstances under which I killed him were such that no jury on earth would have convicted me. I know that now. But at the time, I was only a frightened kid, and I ran. So that's not good. Danny's final suggestion is getting some sort of dirt on Levitt that they could hold over him, but Olga says that Jake Levitt is too cowardly to have ever done anything himself. However, this word, coward, begins to give her an idea. Danny says maybe Sir Richard could see this man and frighten him, but Olga says that Sir Richard is, quote, too fine an instrument, end quote, which I love because it's both complimentary and dismissive of Sir Richard in the same breath. And while her fiancé is too soft, Olga can see that Danny is too hard. As she puts it, something between gloves and bare fists is needed. Let us say mittens. That means a woman. Olga then goes on to ask the name of the girl who wants to be the understudy for her as Cora in The Avenging Angel. This girl, Margaret Ryan, has bronze gold hair, just like Olga does, but apparently that's all that poor Margaret has to recommend her because she has no talent whatsoever. Danny was going to fire her in a week, but Olga says to invite Margaret Ryan over to dinner at her place tomorrow night. Oh, and she's also going to need, quote, some good strong knockout drops, something that will put anyone out of action for an hour or two, but leave them none the worse the next day, end quote. Okay. Olga also asks Danny if she really is a good actress, which to be honest felt a little like fishing for a compliment to me. But as expected, he assures her, there's been nobody like you since Dews. And that, of course, is a reference to Eleonora Dews, who actually would pass away just 1 year later in 1924. She was a hugely celebrated Italian actress who did lots of Ibsen. Is anyone from New York going to see An Enemy of the People with Jeremy Strong and Michael Imperioli by any chance? It's on Broadway now. I'm jealous if you're going. There will always be celebrated actors doing Ibsen. Let us hope. So celebrated was Eleanora Dews that the First Lady of the United States, Mrs. Grover Cleveland, gave a tea in her honor at the White House in 1896, shocking the nation. An actor in the White House? Oh, if only those in 1896 knew what was in store in the 20th and 21st centuries for the White House. Moving right along, I learned that Eleanora Dews retired from acting in 1909. So it's possible that the young teenaged Christie saw her during this period. But interestingly, she made a triumphant return to the stage in 1921 in both Europe and the US. So that was just 2 years before this story. And she passed away while she was on a US leg of that tour. So she seems to have been touring right around the time that Christie was writing this story. So I have to imagine Christie saw her then, or that she was at least top of mind as a result of this tour. Olga dismisses Danny, and she has her secretary, Miss Jones, write a letter back to Jake Levitt, which is just as gloriously subtextual as his was. I'll read this one out as well. Dear Sir, I cannot recall the lady of whom you speak, but I meet so many people that my memory is necessarily uncertain. I am always pleased to help any fellow actress, and shall be at home if you will call this evening at 9 o'clock. Yours faithfully, Olga Stormer.
I have the honor to be your obedient servant, A.Ham.
I will just note, and this is the only error that I found in this story, that Olga had told Danny to invite Margaret Ryan tomorrow night I checked this in both copies of the story that I have, both within While the Light Lasts and Other Stories, and the copy that my loyal listener transcribed for me out of that Centennial booklet. And the error is in both versions. So I have to imagine this is just a typo that no one noticed when it was published. Just wanted to point that out. I will also note that the serialized version of this story, A Trap for the Unwary, the version that appeared in the Centennial booklet, divides the story into sections. The first section, which runs from the beginning to this moment in the story, is titled Blackmail. And now we move on to the next section titled The Spider and the Fly. So thank you again to my loyal listener for that transcription, because I would not have gotten those subtitles without her efforts. Okay, so Jake Levitt comes to Olga's flat and he presses the bell. No one answers, but then he sees the door is unlatched, so he lets himself in. And there is a note on the table that reads as follows: "Please wait until I return. Oh, Stormer." Simple enough. So he waits. But something is making him feel uneasy, and this feeling grows and grows until finally he spies a hand sticking out from the black velvet drapes that are hanging over one of the windows in this room. And when he touches the hand, he notes that it is cold, quote, "a dead hand," end quote. Jake flings back the curtains, and here is what he sees, quoting again from the text: "A woman lying there, one arm flung wide, the other doubled under her as she lay face downwards, her golden bronze hair lying in disheveled masses on her neck." Naturally, Jake assumes that this is Olga Stormer. He feels for a pulse, and Christie writes, "As he thought, there was none." So just as naturally, Jake assumes that Olga has died by suicide as a result of his blackmailing scheme. Perhaps this has happened to him before with past victims. Yikes. But then Jake sees a red cord wrapped around the woman's neck, and as he touches it, the woman's head sags, and he sees that this woman's face is purple. Clearly, she has been murdered, but just as clearly, she is not Olga Stormer. So Jake turns around only to be confronted by the terrified eyes of a maidservant crouching against the wall. And this maid accuses Jake of having killed the woman. "Oh my Gord, you've killed her," is what she actually says. And Christie does write God as Gord with the R. Jake tells this maid that he found the woman dead, but the maid says she saw him pull on the cord and strangle her. She even heard the woman make a gurgling cry. Jake realizes the maid must have come in just as he was handling the rope, and that the gurgling cry was his gurgling cry upon making such a grisly discovery. But he knows instantly that this maid will swear to having witnessed him do the deed. So he is totally sunk here. Though he doesn't give up entirely, not yet. Christie writes, "On an impulse, he said, eyeing her narrowly, 'That's not your mistress, you know.' And the maid responds that she is well aware of this. She says that the woman is an actress friend of Miss Stormer's, though the two of them were in a big old fight that evening. And now Jake Levitt sees what's happened. Olga Stormer has done it again. She killed this woman just as she killed that man long ago, and she's trying to pin it on him, killing two proverbial birds with one proverbial stone." Jake is a trapped rat at this point, so we shouldn't be surprised that it takes him about 2 seconds to seriously consider strangling this poor maid to death with his bare hands. But fortunately for the maid, there is a gun on the table beside her, which she picks up and points at Jake. He, for his part, is pretty certain that a revolver in Olga Stormer's flat is almost definitely going to be loaded, so he hightails it on out of there. And he's barely out of the building before he's making plans in his head for a permanent escape. Here's what Christie writes. "To Gravesend as quickly as possible. A boat was sailing from there that night for the remoter parts of the world. He knew the captain, a man who, for consideration, would ask no questions. Once on board and out to sea, he would be safe." Woo! Thank goodness poor Jake Levitt escapes the clutches of that murderous actor. Am I right? Not entirely. Which is why it is time for some clues, and this isn't a puzzle mystery, so we don't really have any clues in this story, but let's pretend we do. Let's construct a bridge of clues anyway, because there are a few Christie classics at work in the solving, or at least clarifying, of what's actually going on here. Clue number 1 is never underestimate the help. Oh, how I wish Catherine Brobeck were here to say that for me. And the deduction we should make from that is that every other character in this story is given a name except for that nameless maid who appears at the end of the story. Is it possible that this maid could be one of the other characters dressed up to look like a maid? Do such things ever happen in Christie stories? I mean, as pointed out by 2 astute listeners, they happened in Miss Marple Tells a Story, for instance. They also happened in the Miss Marple short story, The Affair at the Bungalow, which is a personal favorite of mine, and in 3-Act Tragedy and Death in the Clouds, and many other novels. So there is that. Clue number 2. Okay, let's just be honest. We all know that the maid is actually Olga in disguise because she has to be. And I love that Christie even clues this a little bit with that over-the-top accent she gives Olga's lines as the maid. Oh my gourd, you've killed her. This maid is officially dropping more H's than Eliza Doolittle.
Now, repeat that after me. In Hartford, Hereford, and Hampshire, hurricanes hardly ever happen.
In Hartford, Hereford, and Hampshire, hurricanes hardly ever happen.
Oh, no.
So it makes sense that Olga would dress up as the maid to enact this little ruse to scare the daylights out of Jake Levitt and send him running away for good. But that still means she must be a murderer. Or Margaret Ryan, right? This would-be understudy who is obviously the woman lying dead among the drapes. But not so fast. And the deduction to this clue is my favorite aspect of this case because it resurrects a very controversial critique that I had of Christie Crown Jewel, and then there were none. In that novel, Christie's third-person omniscient narrator, who, unlike Dr. Shepard in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, is meant to be trusted and has to be trusted, that narrator refers to Justice Wargrave's hand as a dead hand when Justice Wargrave is found murdered in the course of the story. But we learn at story's end that Wargrave was not dead when he was discovered in this way. I cried foul when Catherine and I covered And Then There Were None. It was one of my few criticisms of the writing of that novel. But one of you astute listeners, and many of you astute listeners actually over the years, as people have continued to discover the podcast and listen to that episode, many of you have pointed out to me that one of the official definitions of dead is having the appearance of death or deathly. So we can make the argument that Christie just follows the rules, calling Wargrave's hand a dead hand. And she does the exact same thing here in 1923 with Margaret's dead hand. Our deduction is that even though we are told that it's a dead hand, it might not be a dead hand. And of course it's not a dead hand because Olga is the badass heroine of this story. She's not going to kill anyone, other than that man she killed when she was younger, of course. But we're meant to believe her that he deserved it. And this deduction turns out to be all too correct, because in a final section of this short story titled adorably, "The Mittens Won!" ! That's in the serialized version of the story. Olga calls Danny at 11 o'clock that same night and tells him that, unfortunately, he's going to have to give that understudy role to the garbage actress, Margaret Ryan. And I'm just going to read out the last few sentences of the story because with her trademark economy, lightness, and wit, yes, Christie was already combining these writerly powers as early as 1923. Our favorite author wraps up this delightful little story. Prepare a contract for Miss Ryan, will you? She's to understudy Cora. It's absolutely no use arguing. I owe her something after all the things I did to her tonight. What? Yes, I think I'm out of my troubles. By the way, if she tells you tomorrow that I'm an ardent spiritualist and put her into a trance tonight, don't show open incredulity. How? Knockout drops in the coffee, followed by scientific passes. After that, I painted her face with purple grease paint and put a tourniquet on her left arm. Mystified? Well, you must stay mystified until tomorrow. I haven't time to explain now. I must get out of the cap and apron before my faithful Maud returns from the pictures. There was a beautiful drama on tonight, she told me, but she missed the best drama of all. I played my best part tonight, Danny. The Mittens won. Jake Levitt is a coward, all right, and oh, Danny, I'm an actress. Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
Now that is how you end an Agatha Christie short story. And I just like to point out the superiority of Christie's original title, The Actress, because it seems obvious from the beginning of the story that the actress must be referring to Olga Stormer. But in fact, there are two actresses in this story, and Margaret Ryan's unwitting acting job as a corpse is central to the plot. So there's just that slight little double meaning there to the title that Christie chose. Okay, so in closing, we have to talk about how there are so many echoes of so much Christie in this one little short story. Here is what Tony Medawar writes in the afterword to the story within the While the Light Lasts collection. This story illustrated Christie's great skill at taking a particular plot device and presenting it again, perhaps in the same form but from a different perspective, or with subtle but significant variations to conceal it from the reader. And indeed, I have been begging Tony to come onto the podcast again to talk about this specific skill of Christie's. He has promised me he will when he has the time, and I'm using this as yet another opportunity to cajole him in a public way. I will be keeping you to your promise, Tony. Mark my words. I really can't wait to do that episode with him because this is something that no one else does as well as Christie. It's a Christie-specific trick, and we really need to have an episode focused on it. To add on to what Tony said, I was reminded of when Christie describes how Mrs. Ariadne Oliver can riff 1,000 different ways on a single idea, because we can see Christie doing this with the bones of this tale in short stories and novels to come. For instance, I already mentioned The Affair at the Bungalow, where we have an actress dressing up as a maid, but in that case, the actress's understudy is fully conscious during the scheme, and she pretends to be the actress in question. This would, of course, mean that the understudy would have to be trustworthy, since unlike poor Margaret Ryan, she wouldn't be knocked out during the entire escapade. That was one of the reasons Miss Jane Marple advises the one and only Jane Hellier, seeming dingbat actress, not to go through with this scheme, which she had pretended had already happened. She was basically just workshopping it. We discussed this short story at the Agatha Christie Festival in Torquay last year when we were crowning Agatha Christie's greatest short story. And the fact that this is technically a future crime is one of many reasons that I cherish The Affair at the Bungalow. In Murder in the Mews, we basically have another spin on this situation where the Olga Stormer character is not honest with her fiancé, and as a result of being blackmailed, she does actually kill herself, which is what Jake Levitt thought was going on for a moment. So in that story, which was also nominated for Agatha Christie's greatest short story at the festival last year, the suicide is made to look like a murder by the victim's roommate and friend so as to incriminate the Jake Levitt character, the dastardly blackmailer. This is such a great spin on the exact same scenario. I'll also just mention two full-length novels. In Lord Edgware Dies, Christie once again makes great use of the resemblance between two actresses, though in an entirely different way. And in Evil Under the Sun, she once again makes great use of the impersonation of a dead body by a live person. I could come up with a bunch more comparisons if I tried. The possibilities are endless, and Tony and I will discuss those endless possibilities at some point. I also just have to mention that this short story put me in mind of the Sherlock Holmes short story, The Adventure of the Copper Beeches, which is one of my favorites. In that one, a governess gets way more than she bargained for when she takes a governess position with the unusual requirement of cutting short her uniquely beautiful chestnut-colored hair. So that story also hinges on the resemblance between two women. I totally remember the Jeremy Brett adaptation of this story, but I looked it up out of curiosity when I was prepping for this episode, and I did not remember that Natasha Richardson actually plays the governess in that adaptation. I'm going to have to rewatch that. We know Christie was a big Holmes fan, so I wonder if she was inspired by this story, even just subconsciously. By the way, in that final paragraph of the story I read out, Olga Stormer references scientific passes, knockout drops in the coffee followed by scientific passes. I have to assume that scientific passes are some version of hypnotherapy. If anyone knows for sure, get in touch with me. I couldn't really figure that one out. Regardless, I am in awe of both Olga Stormer and Agatha Christie, but mainly of Agatha Christie, because I just have to note that she leaves the door open to not fully believing in the power of Olga Stormer's acting, given those hammy lines of dialogue that we heard when Olga was pretending to be her maid, Maud. I think that's really funny, and it's done with a light touch. And you know what? Even if she's not as good as she thinks she is, Olga Stormer got the job done. And that is what actors do in Christie. They get the job done, no matter how dirty or murderous that job may be. That is The Actress / A Trap for the Unwary by Agatha Christie. I hope you enjoyed that. I sure did. For my next episode, it's going to be a little bit of a shorter episode just because I am going to be on tour for my mystery novel, The Busybody. I had so much fun talking about screen adaptations with Teresa Peschel that I'm doing a little follow-up to that episode, a little addendum, where I am going to be ranking 10 Hercule Poirot performances on the screen, big and small, and 10 Miss Jane Marple performances. So I will get to talk a little bit more about the screen adaptations of Agatha Christie, which are so important, in which I'll be speaking about in a few months with my dream team of co-panelists at the Agatha Christie Festival. So again, click on the link in the show notes if you would like to purchase tickets for that panel or for any of the wonderful panels happening at the festival this coming September. Click on the link to my website for more information about my appearances on my upcoming tour. I hope to see as many of you as possible in the coming weeks. If you would like bonus content, you can always head on over to the podcast's Patreon page. Click on the link in the show notes. I am currently reading Overture to Death by Ngaio Marsh for April's Patreon episode. That is what I will be covering in April, and I am loving it. Why did it take me this long to start seriously reading Ngaio Marsh? I do not know, but I'm glad that I finally am. I will be discussing her and that book in the days to come, so check it out if you'd like. You can always email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. And you can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame and on Instagram at allaboutagatha. And you can find me on Facebook at Kemper Donovan Books. Please take a moment to give the podcast a rating and or a review. It's so appreciated. And I'll see you next time. Bye.